Coming up on the newscast, North Korea fires artillery rounds again, violating the 2018 military agreement. Seoul and Washington closely monitor the situation and strengthen readiness. China expressed hopes the two Koreas will find a political solution to ensure stability on the peninsula. Representatives of Kakao issued a public apology, and a co-CEO vowed to take responsibility by stepping down. Lawmakers introduced a number of bills aimed at preventing disruption to essential digital services. Evacuation operation begins in Kherson. Russia's new military commander described the war in Ukraine as tense and placed emphasis on safely evacuating the local population. Hello, it's good to have you with us. I'm Daniel Che. Let's begin with the top story at this hour. North Korea fired more artillery rounds into the sea despite strong warnings, violating the 2018 military agreement again. This comes just hours after it carried out similar provocations overnight. Bae Eun-ji starts us off.
From 12:30 on Wednesday afternoon, North Korea fired around 100 artillery rounds toward the West Sea. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said it detected them being fired from North Korea's Yeonan County. The JCS explained Wednesday morning that although none of the shells landed in South Korea's territorial waters, they did land in maritime buffer zones, north of the Northern Limit Line. The buffer zones are boundaries that have been set up to ease military tension along the two Koreas' border areas through an inter-Korean military agreement signed on September 19, 2018. The JCS added that in response to the latest firing, it sent warning messages to the north numerous times for violating the military agreement. It also said it's monitoring the situation through close cooperation with the U.S. and is strengthening readiness. This comes less than a day after the regime fired 250 rounds late Tuesday night, which was also a violation of the military agreement as the shells landed in maritime buffer zones near the border. Pyongyang fired around 100 into the West Sea from around 10 p.m. on Tuesday, and another 150 rounds were fired into the East Sea an hour later. Earlier in the day, South Korea's JCS has sent a warning, urging the regime to immediately halt such provocations.
Provocations like this from North Korea are not only a clear violation of the September 19th military agreement, but they also undermine the peace and stability of the Korean peninsula, as well as the international community.
For the past few weeks, North Korea has engaged in multiple provocations. Last Friday, it fired a total of 560 artillery rounds toward the maritime buffer zones. A day before that, 10 or so North Korean warplanes flew near the inter-Korean border, crossing the so-called tactical action line, something that's not happened for the past 5 years. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
On North Korea's provocation, China voiced hope of preventing the situation from worsening into, quote, tit-for-tat shows of military might. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin made the remarks during a briefing on Wednesday when asked to comment on the regime's recent activities. He said Beijing hopes the two Koreas stick to finding a political solution focusing on safeguarding peace and stability on the peninsula. The top diplomat also stressed the importance of resolving things in a balanced way through dialogue and negotiation. Meanwhile, Seoul and Washington carried out a joint river crossing operation drill, part of a larger annual military exercise in South Korea. The field training involved 1,000 troops from both sides, as well as K2 tanks and Apache choppers. Min Suk-hyun fills us in.
As part of the annual Hoguk defense drills aimed at enhancing combat readiness and joint force capabilities to counter North Korea's nuclear and missile threats, the South Korean Army on Wednesday carried out a river crossing training exercise with U.S. forces. About 1,000 South Korean and U.S. troops took part in the roughly 6-hour drills, which involved 50 combat vehicles, including K2 tanks. Apache and Cobra attack helicopters, as well as KF-16 fighters, were also used in the warlike drills. Wednesday's exercise was conducted under a virtual battlefield situation in where South Korean and American troops practiced building floating bridges for tanks, armored vehicles, and foot soldiers to cross rivers.
So the purpose of today's training was to conduct a large-scale wet gap crossing operation combined with both U.S. and ROK forces to validate our capabilities. So far, it's been extremely successful and demonstrated the strength of the U.S.-ROK alliance.
The 12-day Hoguk exercise that began this Monday will run until October 28th. The field training comes at a time when North Korea has carried out several missile tests while firing hundreds of artillery shells into waters off its east and west coasts. Pyongyang has angrily responded to the combined military exercises between South Korea and the U.S., calling them an invasion rehearsal. Min Suk-hyun, Arirang News.
Poland agreed to buy more weapons from South Korea. In the latest arms deal, the country signed a deal to buy 288 artillery rocket launchers on top of its previous purchases of tanks and howitzers. The deal is estimated to be worth about $5 billion. It comes as part of Poland's efforts to bolster defense following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The weapons are made by Hanwha Defense. If the deal goes through, shipping is expected to begin next year. Elsewhere around the world, Russia's new military commander Sergei Surovikin admitted Tuesday that the situation was very difficult in the occupied city of Kherson. Tens of thousands of local civilians and officials are currently being evacuated from the city ahead of attack from Ukraine, according to the Moscow-installed local leader Vladimir Saldor. Meanwhile, Ukraine faces a harsh winter. The ongoing war has caused massive power outages across the country. President Zelensky said Russian terrorist attacks damaged critical infrastructure, that almost a third of Ukraine's power facilities have been destroyed in the last 8 days. According to officials, more than 1,000 towns and villages still have no power. South Korea was thrown into chaos over the weekend after a fire caused the country's biggest mobile messenger app, Kakao, and top portal website go offline. Most services are up and running again. Kakao's co-CEO resigned over the issue. Jung brings the updates.
Kakao's nationwide shutdown paralyzed the whole country as it lasted for more than 30 hours before most services were up and running again. Representatives of Kakao made a public apology on Wednesday, and one of the co-CEOs, Nam Gung-hoon, said that he'll take responsibility and step down.
When we think of our users and partners who experienced inconveniences communicating, taxi drivers who could not take calls, or business owners who couldn't use the marketing channel, we will take this opportunity to completely inspect and reform the whole Kakao system.
The nationwide digital shutdown disrupted nearly every sector of the country, from banking to catching a cab. Small business owners were hit especially hard by the blackout, as many of them rely heavily on Kakao services to reach customers. An owner of a local cake shop says he stayed up all night at his shop on Saturday waiting for the service to resume normally.
We receive orders only through KakaoTalk, so it is directly connected to our sales. During the blackout, we couldn't do any work. Rather than compensation, I would appreciate it if Kakao can prevent anything like this from happening in the future.
Taxi companies relying on the taxi hailing app Kakao T also suffered huge losses over the weekend as drivers struggled to find customers during the blackout. They blame Kakao's monopolistic dominance of the market.
Normally, on average, 18 drivers work each day, but only 4 came to work today. Drivers were not able to work properly for 3 days, so our earnings were down by around 80%. There are about 70,000 taxis operating in Seoul, and 100% of them are Kakao T users.
Kakao has set up an emergency committee to deal with the situation and come up with compensation plans. The CEO says they have opened up a channel where people can report their losses.
Based on the reports, we will discuss who to compensate and how much to pay them. We will consider compensating not only those who've been using our paid services, but also our users and partners who've suffered losses due to the blackout.
He added that Kakao will swiftly pay compensation before clarifying responsibility with SKCNC, which runs the data center where the fire broke out. Ji-young, Arirang News.
Lawmakers introduced a number of bills aimed at preventing the kind of disruption to essential digital services. This comes after people and businesses were suddenly unable to use KakaoTalk and related services for quite some time. Lee Kyung-un has the latest from Parliament.
In disaster situations, the South Korean government executes its contingency plan for broadcasting communications. It has been set up using guidelines from the Science and ICT Ministry to prevent, control, and quickly recover from disasters on a state level. Under current law, the guidelines apply to major communications broadcasters like TV networks. But following the recent Kakao crisis, rival parties have introduced a series of bills aimed at including the providers of internet communications as well as data centers in the master plan. And Wednesday, the ruling People Power Party reached an agreement with the government to push for swift legislation.
It's a big issue. We aim to draw up a compromised bill with the Democratic Party and push it through as a priority bill by the end of the year.
The PPP and the government are also pushing to mandate a backup system for information service providers. This includes duplexing, which is installing standby servers that can be put into operation in the event that the main server goes down. Also in preparation for a larger scale accident, as was the case with the Kakao crisis when an entire data center is affected, is dualization, which is running twin data centers in separate locations run by different providers. A PPP lawmaker also introduced a related bill, but the party says the government will push the initiative as an executive guideline too. The move comes after a similar bill was already introduced 2 years ago, but that failed to pass due to opposition from IT companies, including Google that was setting up its data center in Busan. Both parties also objected, citing privacy issues. This time, however, the legislation is likely to gain momentum and support from both parties as they agree on the massive influence platform providers have on people's daily lives, not to mention national security at a time of increasing missile threats from North Korea. Yoon, Arirang News.
Seoul is hosting the General Assembly of the Association of National Olympic Committees. In his keynote address to participants, President Yoon stressed the importance of the spirit of freedom and solidarity in sports. Han Sung-woo brings the highlights from the annual event.
The Olympic organizations of 204 countries, including 17 taking part online, met in Seoul on Wednesday at the COEX Convention Center for this year's General Assembly of the Association of National Olympic Committees. Joining them were some 800 key figures in the world of sport. In his keynote address, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol spoke about the spirit of freedom and solidarity, which has been a recurring theme in many of his speeches, especially those given to international audiences.
대한민국 정부가 추구하는 자유와 연대의 정신이 올림픽의 정신과 결코 다르지 않다고 생각합니다. 스포츠 분야 전반에 자유와 연대의 정신이 녹아들 수 있도록 최선을 다하는 것은 물론 스포츠를 통해 국제사회에 기여할 수 있도록 할 것입니다.
He also urged the world to come together in the Olympic spirit to overcome the wide range of challenges facing the international community, including the pandemic and climate change. The president of the International Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach, in his opening remarks, said he was pleased to have the assembly held in what he called the Great Olympic City of Seoul, and said President Yoon is a true friend and supporter of sport and the Olympic movement.
He's a man who is sharing and appreciating the values of sport and who is sharing and supporting the contribution of sport to a healthy society.
Having hosted the ANOC General Assembly back in 1986 and in 2006, Seoul is now the only city to have held the event more than twice. Through this Friday, the Assembly will be discussing preparations for the Paris Summer Olympics in 2024 and the Milano Cortina Winter Olympics in 2026. The mayor of Seoul, meanwhile, is heading to Switzerland next week to explain to officials there that the city would like to host the Summer Games in 2036, which will be almost half a century since it hosted them in 1988. But in the more immediate future, South Korea is preparing to host the 2024 Winter Youth Olympics in Gangwon-do Province. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
Amid ongoing parliamentary audit, the Agricultural Committee passed a revision to Grain Management Act as part of efforts to stabilize rice prices. The main opposition bloc, which has majority pushed for it despite the ruling People Power Party's strong resistance. Kim Bo-kyung has the details.
The main opposition Democratic Party of Korea eventually pushed through a revision to the Grain Management Act, passing it on Wednesday in a full meeting of the Agriculture, Food, Rural Affairs, Oceans and Fisheries Subcommittee. Rice prices have been showing a sharp decrease due to overproduction. According to the Korea Rural Economic Institute, a 20-kilogram sack of rice stayed at around 40,700 Korean won last month, which is around $28. This is almost 25% decrease on year, which is the biggest dip since 1977. To tackle the problem, the DP proposed a revision to the Grain Management Act, making it mandatory for the government to purchase excess rice from farmers when their output exceeds 3% of their expected production or when the price falls more than 5% compared to the average. The ruling People Power Party and the opposition Democratic Party had long been engaged in a game of tug-of-war on the matter, with the PPP opposing the revision, saying it will eventually worsen chronic overproduction.
This is actually an act of oversupplying rice. It hinders the market system and is a financial burden for the government. It causes a vicious cycle of hindering investment in future agricultural technology, as the government needs to spend money on the excess rice and it will lose its value.
According to the PPP lawmakers, farmers are using 72 out of 82 hectares of their land to grow rice, as it is easier to cultivate compared to other crops. If the law is passed, there are concerns that with the government buying the excess, farmers could become tempted to cultivate more, leading to chronic overproduction. Yet the main opposition DP fiercely disagreed. They argued that the act would enable the government to adjust rice production levels and that the bill will strengthen the country's food security.
If the bill forces the government to buy to isolate the overproduced rice, it would actually take part in controlling the production. This revision is to strengthen food security, protect farmers' rights, and bring rice prices back to normal.
The revised bill needs to pass a final review by the Legislation and Judiciary Committee ahead of a vote at the National Assembly's plenary session. The conflict between the two parties is widely expected to continue throughout the entire process. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
The government and industry experts are scrambling to find a solution as the newly enacted U.S. Inflation Reduction Act is expected to deal a blow to Korean EV makers. At the Hyundai Kia Namyang R&D Center, the nation's prime minister vowed to work with U.S. Congress and the Biden administration and look into all channels to quickly resolve this issue. The act includes tax deductions for EVs produced by Korean firms, which in turn is likely to put them at a disadvantage compared to their competitors in the North American market. Hyundai Motor CEO plans to visit the States later this month to attend the groundbreaking ceremony for the auto giant's EV plant in Georgia. According to Bloomberg, White House's climate advisor Ali Zaidi will also be present. Chung Il-sun is expected to bring up the EV bill issue to the official during their meeting. The government is focused on attracting more people to the shipbuilding industry, which has been facing a shortage in recent years. Part of the problem is low pay for contract employees. Solutions could include making it easier to hire foreign workers. Choi Min-jung provides a deeper analysis.
South Korea is pushing to retain its top position in the global shipbuilding industry, mainly by reforming the industry's labor market. Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho on Wednesday met with relevant ministries to address areas for improvement. He pointed out that while the number of orders for Korean ships has increased in recent years, the industry is still facing a lot of challenges, especially with regard to the workforce. The number of people working in ship manufacturing dropped by more than half in 2021, compared to 7 years ago. The number of foreign workers also dropped by 57% compared to 2015. With those figures in mind, authorities have vowed to bolster the industry's workforce by training 3,000 new employees annually and adjusting work visa regulations to bring in more foreign workers. The government is also seeking to improve welfare and the working environment in order to attract new workers. Chu also stressed the need for an improvement to what he called the unfair conditions experienced by some workers in the industry. According to the Labor Ministry, employees of subcontractors only earned 50 to 70% of the wages paid to contractors, despite working 90 more days per year on average. The minister said the gap has negatively impacted productivity and forced workers to leave the industry. The government has also vowed to invest more than $98 million next year to develop core technologies needed to manufacture eco-friendly and autonomous ships. These efforts come as South Korea aims to ramp up major industries amid looming economic uncertainties.
The South Korean economy will face challenges for a considerable period with soaring inflation, increasing downside risks in the global economy, and major countries tightening monetary policies.
On top of these economic difficulties, Chu also pointed out that South Korea should prepare for increased competition with China and Japan. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
On average, young people here in the nation take around 11 months to find their first job, but for a concerning number of them, they recently couldn't land work until 3 years of hunting. During the same period, around 80,000 gave up looking. Here's Lee Seung-jae with a breakdown of the digits.
According to data compiled by the Korean Statistical Information Service and Seoul-based Yonhap News Agency released Wednesday, nearly 360,000 15 to 29-year-olds in South Korea spent 3 years between 2019 and 2021 searching for their first job. That's a jump of more than 35,000 compared to a year earlier. At the same time, 80,000 gave up the search and did not seek a position during the same 3-year period. The number increases even more looking at figures for first-time job seekers in that age group from 2020 to 2021. Statistics show that 633,000 young people in the country sought their first job over that period. On average, between 2019 and 2021, it took young South Koreans 10.8 months to get their first job. But this figure has been on the rise over the past 3 years, with the average at 10 months in 2020 and 10.1 months in 2021. So what does a breakdown of how people in this demographic without jobs spend their time between 2019 and 2021? 29% of all youths between the ages of 15 to 29 spent their time studying or preparing for employment, while 17% spent time raising a child or helping out with household work. However, a staggering 37% spent those 3 years at home not searching for employment at all. This group of people are being referred to as the NEET tribe in South Korea, with NEET standing for not currently engaged in education, employment, or training. The group has been growing in numbers, and experts fear that an increase in the number of people not seeking jobs will contribute to the decline in the country's growth rate. The government is planning to review policies to nurture the younger population to meet field demands and provide incentives for young people to work. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
As the pandemic subsides, South Korea will continue allowing visa-free entry to travelers from Japan, Taiwan, and Macau, a temporary policy that was due to expire at the end of this month. The Justice Ministry plans to allow visa-free entry indefinitely from next month to short-term visitors from 5 other countries and territories: the Solomon Islands, Samoa, Tonga, Kiribati, and Micronesia. Korean passport holders already can travel to these places without a visa. This means South Korea will resume visa-free travel for all the countries to which it was offered before the pandemic.
Temperatures will get warmer starting tomorrow daytime. Highs will finally return to the seasonal norms at 19 degrees Celsius in Seoul. While warm autumn conditions will prevail for the time being, big gaps in daily readings are also expected. Those across inland regions should be wary of heavy fog tomorrow. Until 10 a.m., central regions, Jeollabuk-do and Gyeongsang-buk-do provinces will see dense layers of fog. Visibility is forecast to drop significantly to below 200 meters. Please be extra careful out on the roads. With the cold weather arriving earlier than usual, the leaves are changing their colors faster this year. Southern parts of the country are starting to experience the first fall foliage. Odaesan Mountain in Gangwon-do province has already reached its peak. Sunny skies will dominate nationwide. Seoul will be starting off at 7 degrees tomorrow. Daily highs in Seoul and Chuncheon will be reaching 19. Gyeongju will be topping out at 22 degrees. Wide temperature gaps of more than 10 degrees will take over until this Friday. Please be extra careful not to catch a cold. That's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all from us. As always, thank you for watching.
시작입니다. 하나 스탠바이. 스타트.